Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Cuauhtemoc Lopez Bassols. I work at the Energy Security and Emergency Division at the IEA. Our work really focuses, at least the division's work, focuses on short-term energy security, on oil, gas, and electricity. But particularly today, I'll be concentrating on our oil emergency response system. So thank you for the invitation from Jogmec to present today. My presentation will really focus on three key elements. So one, I'll give you a small brief overview of some of the current and medium-term oil trends to set the scene. I'll then focus on our oil emergency response system. And then to conclude my presentation, I'll be looking at some of the ways in which IEA analyzes oil markets in a disruption. So some of the key elements that are very important in our analysis of the oil markets during a crisis. So again, thank you very much. I'll begin my presentation. As you all might be aware, the IEA was created in the wake of the 73-74 oil crisis. Countries at that point, so large consuming countries, understood that taking a unilateral approach to try to secure oil in disruption was ineffective. That supply disruptions could cause major economic damage if the responses were uncoordinated. So countries already members of the OECD came together and developed together a mechanism of response, so a way to work collaboratively to deal with emergency responses in oil. This is when we signed the International Energy Program, which has as its founding, as its core, the emergency reserves. So these are the stocks that all member countries are obliged to have as part of their obligation to IEA, but as well as demand restraint measures. So these are some of the key elements that underpin the program which founded the IEA. I'll move on to some of the sort of current and sort of forward-looking trends in oil markets, just to give you a context of some of the risk that might be lying ahead. So the global energy landscape has changed considerably since the creation of the IEA, but the role of oil continues to represent quite a large proportion of the total energy world supply, as the graph on the left shows. And then if you see the graph on the right, which is taken from our recent World Energy Outlook from 2025 and taken from the current policy scenarios, we do expect, or the scenario shows that under the current policies, we could be looking at oil demand increasing to about 116 million barrels a day looking ahead. Furthermore, if you look at concentration of production, the world oil supply is really dominated by OPEC plus, so Russia and OPEC, which command a large, about 40 to 50% of current global supply. And looking forward, so again, if you look at the two graphs on the right of the chart, the Middle East and Russia are still expected to command a large majority of global supplies going forward. On the net import side, what you'll see is going forward, again, if this is based on the current policy scenarios, you would see China, India, and Southeast Asia commanding the large majority of the imports, while Europe, Japan, Korea, so OECD countries really having a declining share of imports, this mostly due to a reduction in their oil demand. With regard to refining, we also see a sort of shift eastward of refining capacity. Shutdowns are quite prevalent now in Europe, but you see that new sites, especially expansions, are expected around China and India, and obviously this creates this really means that there will be an increased reliance on a small number of countries for the import of certain oil products, especially as we'll see shutdowns of refining capacity in Europe, for instance. Similarly, as I mentioned, consumption. So consumption here, what we see is on the one hand, petrochemicals and transport sector will continue to command the largest share of oil consumption going forward to 2050. And as I mentioned before, you'll basically see a shift really in the growth of world oil demand, where OECD countries, so Europe and OECD Asia, will see a diminishing share of oil demand, while countries such as India and ASEAN countries, particularly to a lesser extent Africa and South America, will see a relative increase in their consumption of oil going forward. What does that create? So this is just an example. See, these are the current volumes that transit through the different straits. According to the current policy scenario, Malacca Strait, for instance, which currently sees about close to 24 million barrels a day transiting through this strait, will see an increase of up to 4 million barrels a day, hitting almost 28 million barrels a day, given the concentration of production around the Middle East and the shift eastwards of demand in the sort of ASEAN region particularly. Similar, Strait of Hormuz would see an increase of close to 1.5% if according to that scenario. Moving ahead, I think I will talk about the emergency response policies and why they're important. Our founding treaty, so as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, so the IEP, which is our founding treaty of the IEA, envisages a number of supply and demand measures that countries can have to support collective action, that is coordinated release of stocks or making available of stocks or of oil during a disruption. There is measures on the demand side. I won't go into a lot of details, but our member countries are obliged, for instance, to have in place demand restraint measures. So these demand restraint measures, given that the large majority of oil is used in the transport sector, the large majority of these measures, of these programs, focus on that sector. And so these measures could be measures, relatively light-handed measures, which could be encouragements from government to drive in a most ecological fashion, so by inflating tires, for instance, but can also go as far as rationing oil in a severe scarcity of oil in a country. So all of our member countries, as part of the obligation, have to have programs ready to be used, which could rapidly reduce consumption by up to 10% of all their oil demand. And originally, our treaty saw this demand restraint as the first method to deal with a global supply disruption. And as I'll explain a bit later, this has evolved where we are now prioritizing. So member countries have decided to prioritize the use of stocks to add liquidity to the market during a disruption. So again, on the demand side, and even though when the IEA was created back in the 70s, this was still a measure that had a potential to reduce demand. So this fuel switching, when oil was still used for power generation, this is no longer the case. But again, it's one of the measures that exist as part of our treaty about how to reduce demand rapidly during supply disruption. Moving on to the supply side, so obviously I'll talk a little bit more about stock draw and stocks, but our treaty also allows countries that can to use the surge in production. So these are countries that obviously produce oil on a regular basis. So this is another method that can potentially be used during the disruption. So countries that have that spare capacity to bring additional barrels to the market as part of their contribution to a collective action. This is in reality not longer a method that is used, given that most of our member countries that produce large amounts of oil or are net exporters of oil have limited, if no effective spare capacity. Therefore, it is not longer used really as a measure, but it's there obviously in the discussions that we have with our member countries on a regular basis about the potential of adding barrels to the market. But on the supply side, and I'll talk about the different models, we have stock draw or the use of stocks. And I'll now discuss some of the different regimes under which oil is held. So again, as I mentioned, all member countries that are net importers of oil, so even those that produce oil but import more oil than they export, are obliged to have 90 days of stocks. The way in which they decide to hold these 90 days of stocks is really depends on the country. Sometimes it depends on the history of how these stocks were created, when they were created. You have countries that prioritize government stocks. So these are countries, so one of the examples would probably be the United States, where the totality of its obligation of the 90 days is held under the SPR. So this is government-owned, government-controlled, and government-funded stocks. You have, on the other hand, countries who decide to have their 90 days obligation set on the industry. So basically, they oblige their industry to hold these stocks to the level of the 90 days obligation. There's other countries that have created purpose-made vehicles or agencies, for instance, stock holding entities to hold these stocks, either these agencies can be industry-led agencies, such as in the case of Germany, or government agencies such as Ireland, which hold the obligation to the IEA. And obviously, there are a number of countries that decide to have a mixed approach. So part of their obligation is held under industry, and another part is held government. So Japan is, for instance, an example where the government holds public stocks, but also imposes an obligation on industry to hold another amount of stock. So there are different regimes. We are not predictive in which regime is either better or can be used. We are flexible as long as the member country does hold the 90 days. One thing is important before I move on to the next slide is the fact that the way we calculate the 90 days is not only oil that is held for emergencies, but basically all oil, even within the 90 days, even oil that is held for commercial purposes by industry is included in the calculation of the 90 days. So we see this next slide, which shows public stocks. So basically, we call public stocks all stocks held either by government or by agency. Those are the yellow lines, whereas the blue lines are industry stocks. And you'll see that there are some countries where the large majority of their stocks to comply with the 90-day obligation are held by industry, either through an obligation or only commercial stocks. And there's also a number of countries which have a mixed approach to reaching the 90 days. Obviously, you'll see here that there are certain countries that have way over their 90-day obligation. And again, that is because within the calculation of the days of net import, we also include all commercial stocks. This will be more evident in the next slide, but countries and most of the European countries that are also members of the of the IEA, so members of the EU and IEA, have an additional obligation as part of their membership, in which they are not allowed to include commercial stocks as part of their calculation of their obligation towards the EU, and that is reflective in this slide. So they have quite a large amount of stocks over the 90 days, and that is because on top of their obligation of emergency only stocks for the EU, we are counting here their commercial stocks. This is particularly evident here in the next slide, where we show, this is an example of the type of product or oil that is stored as part of the public stocks. So here we're talking only about public stocks. And this, again, IEA does not oblige countries to hold a stock in any particular form, be it crude or product, as long as they complied with the 90 days. The reason why some countries would have a tendency of having larger amounts of crude than product in their reserves would be for depending on their refining capacity, for instance, in each country. It is obviously cheaper to hold crude stocks, but if you don't have the refining capacity, they're of little use during an emergency. So this graph, what it shows is that you'll see the large majority of member countries of the European Union, also members of the IEA, given that as part of their obligation to the EU, they do need to have stocks that are reflective of their consumption patterns, would have a tendency to have larger proportion of stocks of product and much less of crude. So this is just an overview of the stock situation and the way in which member countries of the IEA currently hold their obligation of stocks to the IEA. We now will start looking at why having these stocks is important. So the emergency stocks, as we see it from the IEA, can be very effective to provide liquidity in a very tight oil market. We believe that emergency stocks should be used only to respond to very acute and short-time disruption. We've noticed that holding emergency stocks serves the purpose as well to reassure the market. So even if there is no decision to collectively release oil stocks, the fact that the IEA's member countries hold large amounts of emergency stocks can have that reassuring, that soothing effect on the market without them necessarily being used. And one thing that we note that is very important is the fact that emergency stocks really cannot effectively replace market mechanisms. So using them in the wrong manner could distort market signals and can have longer negative term consequences on markets. So have effects on investment signals, etc. There are not emergency stocks should not be used to manipulate prices. So emergency stocks really are there to provide liquidity, to provide those additional barrels in an event of an actual supply disruption, a physical supply disruption. That is very important in terms of when we believe IEA should collectively release stocks. So as you see, this graph tries to depict from the last 70, almost 75 years, the level of disruptions, of global supply disruptions in the world. Wherever you see red letters, that's where there has been a decision to collectively release oil. And as you see, this is not been used very often. So IEA has collectively released stocks 5 times. So those are the 3 times in August 1990, 91, during the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. Then moving forward during the interruptions in the Gulf of Mexico, the hurricanes Katrina and Rita, where there was 60 million barrels released. Then the Libya civil war, which also saw 60 million barrels a day of a release, of a collective release. And then much more recently, 2 consecutive collective actions of 60 and about 100 million barrels. So a historic amount of about 180 million barrels of oil were released as part of the market situation around the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So IEA does not use the oils very frequently. I'll explain in the next few slides some of the considerations that for us are very important in deciding or not whether to advise our member countries on a collective action. So I won't go into a lot of details about the different mechanisms to release oil or the decision making, but so our founding treaty envisaged an automatic trigger to release oil. So the idea was this: if there's a global supply disruption of about 7 million barrels, 7% of global supplies, then that would automatically trigger a response, a collective response from IEA countries. So this was hard-coded in our founding document. What our member countries realized soon after is that oil market had evolved, had become much more liquid, and therefore having a hard trigger would potentially tie the hands of our member countries, where smaller supply disruptions can have equally important economic impact on our member countries. And therefore, through a decision of our member countries called CERM, there was a decision to allow for more flexibility in terms of when to release stocks. And as part of the decision, the CERM, it allowed the Secretariat, so the people working at the IEA, to consider a number of factors, and member countries to consider a number of factors when assessing the severity of an oil supply disruption and when considering the need or not to release stocks. And so we'll be going through some of these. So some of the elements of this flexibility added by the CERM decision was to look at the magnitude of the disruption. So again, this was a move away from an automatic trigger of 7% supply disruption, which again was part of our treaty and was an automatic trigger to collectively respond. Now with CERM, there was more of a case-by-case basis. So we needed to look much carefully at some elements of the market before determining whether it would be advisable to respond collectively to a disruption. So some of these elements were the sort of magnitude of the disruption, the origin, the causes of the disruption, and obviously the probable evolution, the probable duration as well was important in the consideration. But so was the nature and the conditions of the market at that point. So whether there was a tight market, whether the market could itself absorb this supply disruption. And so some of the elements of this consideration were looking at stock levels, the speed at which they could be effectively brought into the market, also looking at other elements such as existing and effective spare capacity were elements that became so the part of the considerations in a disruption. So in terms of the procedures, as I mentioned, there was CERM, which allow member countries to have more flexibility in terms of when they might want to respond to collective action. And one of the procedures, so again, might get a little bit more technical, but within the CERM, there was a decision to allow for much more rapid response. It's called ICRP. It's not detailed in this slide, but basically, this is the mechanism by which the IEA Secretariat analyzes the market and then suggests to its member countries the release of stocks, depending on some of the elements that I mentioned before and that I'll detail in the next few slides. So this method to initiate a potential collective action is based on a number of steps. So there's a preliminary assessment. So this is when the Secretariat, the IEA itself, starts informing or warning its member countries that there is a likelihood of the disruption or there is a start of a disruption. These preliminary assessments are just generally in the form of short emails with an analysis of the market at the time. If the evolution of the disruption is such that where there is, according to our analysis, the potential need for a collective response to a disruption, then the Secretariat sends an initial assessment in which it proposes the launch of a collective action. This initial assessment includes amounts to be released during the initial period of 30 days. There's a consultation then of about 24 to 48 hours in which member countries can discuss the plan suggested by the Secretariat. If there is consensus, there's a notice of activation, which means that it's the start of the collective action. Then national countries have a number of days to activate their system, and then the time the oil starts to flow could be slightly later, depending on the system each of the countries has to release its oil. Some countries tender the volumes to the market. Other countries, such as those that have imposed an obligation on industry, the government announces through official means a reduction in this obligation, and that's how the volumes, a contribution for that country, are allowed to flow into the market. So there's different mechanisms for the release, and so this release can take a few days or months, depending on the circumstances. What you'll see on the right-hand side of this graph is the country share. So this is the proportional proportion of the total amount of the collective action that each country member of the IEA is responsible for. One of the things that's important to note is that this information of the share is known beforehand, so there is no discussion during the consultation period about which amount each of the countries would need to provide. This is known on a quarterly basis, always at the time of a potential collective action. Countries are already aware of their share. Obviously, this does not change dramatically, as it's based on the proportion of consumption relative to the rest of the group. Now, going again, as I mentioned in the slide before, so there's a number of factors that are important to consider when looking at a collective action. Peak supply, so this is the maximum supply loss of a disruption, is a very important factor, but is not necessarily the only factor that's taken into account. So this graph, similar to one of the graphs that's shown before, shows the size of the different disruptions in the last, this is a little bit shorter, but this is the last 50 or so years. And what you'll see, the graphs in green show those instances where a collective release was launched. But you see, for instance, blue graphs where their peak supply loss was considerably higher. So the 2019 upcake drone attacks, for instance, the market conditions were such that, and the duration of the disruption was such that the countries, members of the IEA, decided collectively that there was no need for a release, that the market itself was sufficiently well supplied, and the market could rebalance itself relatively painlessly. So there was no need for collective action. On the other hand, you have the Libyan civil war with a relatively small peak supply loss as a percentage of global demand, but the circumstances and the type of oil that was lost during that disruption created the necessary conditions for a release. There was a very particular type of crude that was missing in the market at a particular time where the market was relatively tight, and it was felt that a collective release was necessary. Moving on, this is an important. So the duration of the disruption, again, the size of the peak supply loss must be considered, but be considered in parallel to its likely duration. So how much lost supply can be restored? At the IEA, we really believe that the market is in much better place to solve its own and rebalance itself. It is in those occasions where the market itself is insufficiently supplied to rebalance itself quickly enough without having an effect on member countries' economies that a supply disruption is considered. But generally, the oil market is liquid enough and finds rebalance itself rather quickly. So considerations of how quickly the production from the disruption can be restored is also key consideration. How much are there alternative routes? So if there's a disruption of a strait, say of one of the straits where large amounts of oil transit, whether there are alternative routes, the disruption then might just be short-lived, given that tankers might be able to bypass that, just increasing times to travel, but not necessarily disrupting the flow of supplies, but just delaying supply. So this is another important consideration. The possible evolution and the type of disruption are key elements as well. Disruptions due to human error would probably have very different durations as those due to terrorist attacks, for instance, in which you don't know whether there might be subsequent events. And so these are things that need to be considered when looking at a supply disruption and the consequences and the impact it would have on markets. One thing is for sure, disruptions always happen in a context of uncertainty, and policymakers are often forced to make decisions based on the limited and sometimes imperfect and incomplete information in a short space of time. So waiting until the full picture is clearly seen is really not an option. So the collective actions or decisions to release to release oil as part of collective actions sometimes are done in a context of limited information, but most of the cases we can't wait until we have the complete picture before we decide to act. As you would imagine, and I've been talking about the importance of market context, so knowing the direction, the trajectory of the demand, supply, not only prior to the disruption, but where those elements were heading in the future as part of our analysis is important. For instance, during the 2022 collective actions, when there was a historic release of about 180 million barrels a day, one of the features of the market was a very tight market and a market that was getting tighter. So demand was seen as running way ahead of supply in the months to come, in the quarters to come. And so those elements of not only prior to the disruption, but moving forward are important elements to understand the market and its ability of rapidly rebalancing in a disruption. Spare capacity, I mentioned, is an important factor. I won't go into a lot of details, but effectively at the moment, this is a 2024 figure, but I think currently the spare capacity, only effective spare capacity is probably Saudi Arabia with, according to latest figures, something close to 2 million barrels a day, which is the only real spare capacity. Other elements, so these are my last two slides, I think, that are part, again, in understanding the context in which a supply disruption happens. It is important to know the context. So these graphs, I think, show again the situation of the market prior to the 2022 historic collective releases. So you see on the right-hand side at the bottom, left-hand side at the bottom, the red line, which showed that oil inventories were at the sort of lowest point in the 5-year range, meaning an extremely tight market that had very little chance of rebalancing itself, at least in the short term. At the same time, so stock levels, obviously, as part of the considerations, is key to understand how the market, how tight the market might be. And I think this is my last presentation of slide is the oil prices. So the oil prices, obviously, I mentioned this. So collective actions are not a tool to correct price or control price, and should never be used as a mechanism to influence price. But high prices in a global economy should be taken into consideration. So usually there will be an impact on a direct and immediate effect on price in a disruption, but that might be short-lived. It is important to note that market reactions and movements in prices are not always rational. And are in a lot of cases the reflection of imperfect information at the time. So again, price is an indicator, but not necessarily the only indicator. Again, while the percentage price increase will be an indication of how serious the market considers the disruption, decisions on whether to release should also look at the absolute price levels. So again, going to the 2022 collective action, prices were at the all-time high. I think the highest they had been in the previous sort of 8 years. And therefore, again, another show of market tightness. And finally, so if prices are already high, even a relatively small supply disruption has the potential to cause significant economic damage. So those are the elements that are important when looking at the potential effects of a supply disruption, and in the analysis of whether the market is sufficiently well supplied to be able to deal itself with the disruption. I conclude my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.